Hello, I am Kaarel Vaidla from Sanna Leiutajate külakool in Estonia, and as part of the Democratic Education in Schools project, I am presenting on democratic practices in B classes, B groups. The first question that probably comes to the mind is how do you define big? How big is a big group? And eventually, it really depends. For some discussions, the group gets big really fast. For others, which are more of a consulted, informing nature, you can actually have quite good conversation or discussion going with our big groups without particular design. Um, what I am trying to do here is provide some ideas of democratic inclusive practices that can function across the board um, for group sizes that are very different, but also essentially I'm trying to focus on practices that have helped me with a larger setting. It can be either the class size, which in many schools is quite significant, and also in the discussions that actually span across the whole education institution, including the parents, etc. So the practices I'm presenting on can be helpful in any setting, but I've tried to look at the ones that are even more helpful when more people are getting added to the conversation. And of course, there are different theories about the sizes for different discussions. For example, 1800 rule, which says that you can do strategic discussion and decision making with 8 people, brainstorming with 18, just informing with doesn't really matter. They put the 1800 in that rule. Um, but eventually, with using some of these tools, you can actually have the group sizes increased even for decision making and good brainstorming. So I hope uh, this presentation provides some of the ideas how to bring democratic and inclusive practices into some of the discussions you are having in your environment. The first part of presentation is focused on adding a bit of context. So I'm talking about democratic practices. So what is actually democracy and what are the democratic practices is the first question that comes to mind. And when one looks at the definition, uh, looking at the ancient Greek demokratia, uh, one can understand that democracy is a form of government in which the people have the authority to deliberate and decide legislation. So that is a direct democracy model, or to choose governing officials to do so. So that is a representative democracy. So the core definition of democracy really focuses on its governance aspect. Um, in this case, the democratic practices are not only related to the governance aspect, when we're talking about the democratic conversations in educational system and education environment, then the focus comes to the characteristics of democracy that really define the democracy. And some of them are diversity, equity, and inclusion, essentially respect and tolerance in the conversations. There is a core characteristic of freedom of expression. There is usually a governance aspect to democracy, so participation in decision making, one way or another. There is the aspect of transparency and access to information, informing. Um, Usually, accountability and responsibility is mentioned among the democratic characteristics. And then finally, um, there is, so to say, rule of law, which means that people in the democratic environment are holding common agreements. Um, there is also the notion of liberty or freedom that often feels to be closely connected to democracy. And actually, for a democratic system to function well, probably liberty or freedom needs to be part of the environment. And this can also be defined in two ways. One is the negative liberty, which is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints, where one has negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. So essentially, what it means is that with one's actions or expression, one should not limit the actions and expression of the other, and this is one part of how you can define the liberty and freedom. So essentially, you don't seem to have the obstacles, barriers, or constraints, or other people overstepping your boundaries. So this is kind of a one way to look at the freedom and liberty, like enabling environment for your activity, or rather lack of disabling elements in the environment. The second notion is a positive liberty, which is a possibility of acting or the fact of acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. This is really related to the sense of agency, where you feel you are enabled and capacitated to take action and fulfill your purpose, dreams, etc. So these are the two elements at play in the democratic environment related to a freedom, agency of participants, and also reducing obstacles and barriers of participation. When it comes to democratic education, there are probably two key pillars to it. The definition from EUDEC, European Democratic Education, is that in any educational institution, students have the right for self-directed learning, which is to make their own choices regarding learning and all other areas of everyday life. In particular, they may individually determine what to do, when, where, how, and with whom, so long as their decisions do not infringe on the liberty of others to do the same. So essentially, positioning itself in the positive freedom side, with negative freedom of not to create obstacles for the others. There is a second element of self-governance, to have an equal share in decision making as to how their organizations, in particular their schools, are run and which rules and sanctions, if any, are necessary. So this does bring in the governance aspect of democracy, and essentially the core is that anyone should be able to participate in the decision making of education systems. So this is the democratic education definition from EUDEC. Regarding the democracy and freedom and also the educational aspect of it all, I would like to provide some two thought-provoking citations. So one comes from John Locke in the Thoughts Concerning Education. It is written that none of the things they are to learn should ever be made a burden to them or imposed on them as a task. Whatever is so proposed presently becomes irksome. The mind takes an aversion to it, though before it were a thing of delight or indifference. So this really goes towards the self-directed learning and importance of self-directed learning and the agency of education system participants in there, to have a delight in learning, to still be curious and to drive forward. So this is kind of a value proposition for the self-directed learning already coming from the 17th century. And then one can add about the self-governance aspect, a citation from Calvin Coolidge: free people cannot shift the responsibility for them to the government. Self-government means self-reliance. So this is again about the agency and rather even responsibility and accountability in governance that comes with democratic systems. And also Heather Marsh in Binding Chaos has written that self-governance does not mean no one is responsible. It means everyone is. And that is something to account for in the democratic systems, and especially when talking about widening the circle of decision makers, and or rather including people in decision making in a participatory way. For the final point, in the context setting, EUDEC has also highlighted core elements of a democratic education, and one of them is firm foundations in a values culture of equality and shared responsibility. Respect breeds respect, trust breeds trust, compassion breeds compassion, tolerance breeds tolerance, listening breeds listening. So essentially, having the principles in place and people in the system abiding to these principles, creating a culture of equality, shared responsibility that creates inclusive spaces for people to participate. So that's the first core element. The second one is collective decision making, where all members of the community, regardless of age or status, have an equal say over significant decisions such as school rules, curricula, projects, the hiring of staff, and even budgetary matters. So, this type of participation in decision making seems to be essential for democratic schools and democratic practices in schools. And then finally, again, there is a self directed discovery. Learners choose what they learn, when, how, and with whom they learn it. Learning can happen inside or outside of the classroom, through play as well as conventional study. The key is that the learning is following the students' intrinsic motivation and pursuing their interests. So that is really about positive freedom and providing inspiration and support for the education system participants to act and direct themselves in their learning endeavor. So, this is really the context setting and rather about the value proposition of a democratic practices. I would now skip to the theory part of democratic practices, and here I already start to talk about some of the aspects that need to be considered and be mindful of for the design of the democratic discussions. So here are probably already some helpful tips and framing for it. The first theoretical aspect I would like to cover is the Canevin framework, which was developed by Dave Snowden in 90s, essentially 1999 is one of the dates that is being mentioned about publishing this. And Canevin is a Welsh word for habitat. And the idea of the Canevin framework is that it offers decision makers a sense of place from which to view their perceptions. So it helps to understand what type of decision is needed, what type of action is needed by defining where a certain conversation or action is coming from, what is its domain or area. And essentially, the Canadian framework supports applying fitting approaches for differing environments. So that's what it's about, really understanding the context and designing the decision making system or action or implementation system based on the environment. And in the Canadian framework, essentially, uh, there are four core domains. There is also the disorder, kind of in the middle of them. But usually people talk about simple, complicated, complex, and chaos. Simple is really basic logic environment where there is very clear cause and effective and linear one. Chaos is kind of the opposite. There, you do not really have the logic or linearity or clear implications. So things in a way just happen. Um, and there are approaches to these areas. So for simple, just follow a best practice. For chaotic ones, one probably needs novel practice. And so there are ways how to tackle them. Where we usually are in decision making or in a educational environment are very domains of complicated and complex. So again, in complicated, one can predict the actions happening. It's probably related to some of the past practices and good practices in the environment, and essentially the idea is to sense what is going on, then analyze, Where does it fall in terms of actions that need to be taken, and then finally there is a need for response, which probably in complicated systems can be rooted in the previous good practice or a conscious uh, novel design or action based on the logical analysis of the system. So you can actually see the order of things and the implications and all of that in a complicated system. In the complex system is there probably the participatory processes come into play. In complicated, you don't need a group of people probably to make sense of a situation, because there is still this intrinsical logical alignment. In complex systems, you start to lose that. There are no good answers with some of the settings for one people to analyze, and also it's difficult to foresee the implications of one action. The art of learning how to play is becomes really important here, but this also means that uh, tapping into the diverse perspectives, inclusive methods is really good, because you can uphold the complexity and map out different pathways to experiment with, probe with, and essentially this is where the democratic practices are really helpful in creating the path forward with every step, and also trying to validate the ideas for steps with wider circle of people. And then it takes to things to a certain level of experimentation, like you're probing what is working, what is not working, then you sense it, have a discussion, and then respond. And essentially, this is really about the emerging practice, and uh, to bring emerging practices really to life in education system, it's good to have the participation and engagement from wider circle. I've seen that this really brings benefit. Um, the next theoretical aspect or idea I would like to highlight is Lewis' deep democracy, which has been developed by psychologists Myrna and Greg Lewis, and which has been inspired by Arnold Mindell's process-oriented psychology. This method was born in the transition from apartheid to new democracy in South Africa, and deep democracy, while Kinevin framework it was rather kind of a context setting method where you understand what practices need to be implemented after definition of the domains. The deep democracy is a practical method that makes group dynamics visible and allows one to intervene. So that's the core idea of it. The focus is not on the individual, but on the group as a whole. And in the deep democracy practice, it really focuses on the kind of culture of conversation and taking action, and it focuses on two layers or levels. One is above the waterline, what is really perceivable, understandable, clear, and then at the same time trying to manage the below the waterline dynamics. So that's essentially the core of it. And what it also helps, as I said, with a Canadian framework, in many cases, the use and value of democratic practices really comes to play in the complex dynamic setting or complex domain. Also with deep democracy, there is a focus on inclusion and bringing in the voices, bringing in the no. So you need to have the skills of neutrality, compassion, and listening. And essentially, it's about extending the perspective. So it's just not going with a common good practice or just following the blueprint as one would do in the complicated area in Canadian. It's rather inviting further views to understand the problem better and to also guide towards rather emerging action. So essentially, the steps in the deep democracy process are gain all the views, actively search for other views, and then, so to say, spread the other views. So try to socialize the perspective that is not that common across a group, for people to understand that and understand the value in it. And that's one of the core steps to add wisdom value of the other view to the majority view. So finding ways how to integrate that, making the whole system more inclusive, and hopefully qualitatively increasing the actions or thoughts in the existing system. And then below the waterline, essentially one needs to look out for implicit and explicit activities, like there is a certain resistance in the system, and one needs to manage that, but first sense that. From implicit side to explicit, it's rather starting with jokes, sarcastic jokes, excuses, gossip. Like already with the gossip, one starts to come to more explicit signs, and then it's a pair communications disruption starts to happen. Things start to go slow. There might be strike, and then finally, really explicit from step is withdrawal. So try to see that, and then especially then you have this resistance. Try to invite the no and bring that to the main discussion, and essentially one thing that is important here is uncover and resolve these deeper issues. So there needs to be setting of the safety rules for people to participate, engage, and share authentically. Try to create a space where people can, so to say it all, and then try to make sense of, okay, what hit home, what actually makes sense, and finally operationalizing the insights. So this is the deep democracy, more practical, more practical, step by step way how to include the different voices, rather what to be mindful of, and certainly there are practices in there like check in, check out, that are really important in creating the environment for sharing and having a discussion. The final theoretical point I'm sharing in this presentation is a polarity management, which comes from a theory from Barry Johnson, the book Polarity Management, identifying and managing unsolvable problems. And essentially, the polarity management increases in value as a system or issue, increases in complexity, increases in diversity, increases in speed of change, increases in resistance to change. Again, really valuable in complex setting, but also important in the setting of education, where you often have diversity, complexity, and resistance to change. So a practice that I've been finding really helpful. And with polarity management, the value added or benefit is that it can help to simplify the complexity without being simplistic. It can capitalize on diversity without alienating the diverse groups, provide predictability and stability amidst accelerating change, and convert resistance to change to a resource for sustainable ongoing changeability. So what is important in polarity management is to note different drivers that are influencing the system, and then also note the different polarity areas, and then be mindful about how the needle moves in these areas, and trying to ensure that neither aspect of polarity is neglected uh, in a similar way as one is inviting the no in deep democracy. So trying to really ensure that the discussion and action is mindful of the polarities in play, and doesn't go out of balance. So that's essentially the core. Um, Regarding some of the polarities at play in the education discussions, um, I would highlight the polarity between self and group dynamics, and also in democratic discussions. So there needs to be mindfulness of self, but there also needs to be awareness of group and empathy. So the mindfulness helps to come to the positive freedom of self expression and real participation. The group awareness and empathy is more related to the negative freedom of not stepping on others' toes and creating a safe space for them. And at any democratic B group discussion, these polarities are at play. You shouldn't lean too much to one side, like on the self side, and just expressing your views, not really integrating what others are saying. But you shouldn't also dissolve yourself in the group dynamics and just going on full listening mode, not contributing. So the balance needs to be found, and this is the polarity management. The next one, again, is the self level. There is a reflection side, and on a group level, there's speaking up. So that's kind of the same polarity dynamic on a different level. So often in democratic practices, this polarity management is especially helpful than balancing out the self expression, the self level, and then the group level. Um, then, on kind of a rule setting level, one can see the polarity and tension between the self freedom level and the group regulation level. So, for the group to function, one needs regulation, one needs rules, one needs principles. But you have to be mindful, like, what is their actual extent. They need to be enabling constraints for the system, and there also needs to be space for freedom of self, for expression, for activity, for self-guided discovery. So balancing up this self and group level in freedom and regulation. Then, if one thinks about the governance aspect, there is again potential polarity dynamic in play between direct participation and representation. So this needs to be also well balanced out. Sometimes representation makes complete sense for a group to be functional, but then direct participation again creates agency. So this is another thing to be mindful of when it comes to governance. In these discussions, usually the group side provides a general structure and the governance aspect, and then the individuals bring the actual content. So you need to ensure that it doesn't become too bureaucratic in a way, that it's only about the governance structure and systems, and people can actually contribute meaningful content to it. And finally, there is the self-directed and group-directed aspect. So group can also provide guidance and direction, but if it comes too much, the self-directed aspect is getting lost. And if you get too into the self-directed side of things, then you might have some troublesome dynamics on the group level. So this also needs to be balanced out. These are the three practices I wanted to highlight in this presentation. There is also nonviolent communication practice and sociocracy that have been really helpful for me in management of big groups and big classes. However, these two theories are covered in depth in two other modules, so I'm not really presenting on these things. Finally, it makes sense to provide some tips and tricks for practice. I talked a lot about theory. I'm myself theory inclined in thinking through and designing for democratic practices, but in the end, there are some really easy practices that one can implement at ease, and I'm providing some of these practices that I'm using when dealing with bigger groups, big group dynamics. So first of them is a checking in. I mentioned it briefly with a deep democracy, but essentially checking in helps with mindfulness, for personal level mindfulness regarding one's own feelings, thoughts, and expectations, noting the personal needs and expectations, and also the group mindfulness, empathy, awareness, mindfulness regarding the atmosphere, group needs and expectations, alignment and misalignment. And there are some check-in questions that I am using in my practice. For example, how are you arriving to the space? How are you feeling? What are your thoughts? What are your needs and expectations? So these can be some of the checking in questions that really help with mindfulness, tuning in with oneself, but also tuning into the group atmosphere. Um, the next one that is really important, I also talked about the safety of participation a bit. So this is the holding of a space. It can happen on personal level, continuously looking out for everyone's needs and expectations during the conversation. It can also happen on a group level, monitoring the energy, emotions, and actions of a group. So one needs to design for the physical discussion space, but also maintain it. Appoint people responsible for maintaining safe space and who are available for checking in. So if anyone has a concern, they have people to turn to, share their concern, and get support from. And then it always makes sense to have actually a facilitator of the space, assign other roles as needed, for example, timekeeping, documentation. There can be other roles that help to create an environment where people thrive and feel heard. So that's a second practice I would highlight. The third one is creating clarity. Uh, on a personal level, what is expected from each individual, codifying their role and responsibility so people understand why are they participating in certain practice and what is their expected contribution, and also have agency. And then on a group level, what is expected from the group, codifying the role and responsibility of a group, so really understand what the collective is doing together. And this includes clearly and concisely worded mandates. It also includes the levels of participation and responsibility matrix, either ratio or Darcy. So in levels of participation, people need to know really well, like, are they just informed so they don't expect high level engagement? Are they consulted so they need to provide input? Are they already on the involved level so they are working directly and engaging directly with the content, or are they even collaborators, which is even high level of engagement and really provide solutions to the problems, find paths forward together, even co-create, co-design. Um, the final level is the actual inclusion in the decision making. So it needs to be clear what is the expectation regarding the level of participation in the conversation, and it's similar to the project striving forward. There is a Darcy matrix, Racy matrix. It doesn't matter which one is being used. Darcy is presented here because it has a good alignment coming from, again, the levels of participation. So you have informed level, consulted level. These are really aligning well with levels of participation. And then you have to have a responsible level. People understand that they are responsible of delivering certain actions. You need to have accountability. So one person who is accountable for a project or activity, and then it needs to be made really clear who is actual decider, like who makes the decision on things. Then for democratic practices, it's very helpful to have a sense of purpose. So this is actually something that really creates agency among people. So on a personal level, why the person is here, what is their added value, where is this all going? On a group level, why the group is gathered, what is the outcome and impact? So really making it clear uh, the the why behind the gathering discussion, what is happening. And what can help is clearly defined or concisely defined vision, mission, and purpose, common agreement regarding the purpose, and also inviting the why. There are different exercises, for example, 5 whys, and then 5 hows, how to actually put it into practice. So there are tools that can be used to getting in touch with the sense of purpose. Um, it is probably related to the sparking agency. So we are thinking about the self-guided approaches. Sparking agencies is in the heart of that. So on a personal level, people need to understand that they have a voice, they have power to shape the space, and they are a member of a group. And then in a group, people need to understand we are in this together, we are able to figure it out, we can have the impact. And essentially, this can be achieved by enabling and empowering people to express their needs and expectations, the checking part also, but also during the conversation. Um, what is helpful is co-definition of roles and co-creation of processes, so people really feel like they are part of it. And finally, one often just needs to let the group dynamics flow, so creating the space there where group dynamics can evolve and settle. Practicing in inclusion is the next practice, and this also comes on two levels. Like for a personal level, the key message here is I matter, I belong, I'm represented in the group. And on a group level, every member of a group is valuable and adds richness to what we are doing or accomplishing. Like this is a key sentiment to achieve. And then how to achieve that is consider accessibility of processes and content. So you reduce the barriers, remove the aspects in the sense of negative freedom, so people actually have a space and accessibility to contribute. Proactively bring in marginalized and excluded voices. This is the inviting the no from a deep democracy practice. And then finally, one needs to facilitate louder voices and use representative methods. There are some, like a usual facilitation method for this is 1, 2, 4 all, where you start with a personal reflection, then discussion in pairs, then in fours, before bringing it to a full room. And usually it really helps to create a common perspective, sense of togetherness, rather than just a couple of loud voices speaking up. Consenting is one of the mechanisms that will be probably covered deeper in the sociocracy module, but overall, this one is really helpful in creating shared understanding and alignment. On personal level, it creates understanding. I do not have to agree. I can have safety in trying, and my objections are taken into account. And then on a group level, we consider all the voices in a group to find solutions we are all comfortable with. So for consenting, the important part is that there needs to be really good clarity of proposals and their implications. And then gradients of agreement can be used. It can be just consent, not consent, but one can also use gradients of agreement from 100% agreement to vetoing, and in between you might have different levels. There is a lot of materials available regarding different gradients of agreement, but essentially you have the levels of agreement with minor points of contention, support with reservations. One can abstain or say that it needs further discussion, or just say I don't like it, but I will support it, or have a serious disagreement without any support, or just vetoing the discussion item. So these can be used just to monitor the room and understand how close or far the discussion is from actual consent or agreement. And finally, one needs to nurture creativity. So it can happen on personal level. One can be creative, can be inspired, can inspire others, and then have creativity of members of a group, making it more innovative and resilient. By inviting creativity, probably more can be achieved and the connection is stronger. And one has to create intentional spaces for creativity. And the practice here is looking out for small sparks of creativity and encouraging them and bringing them to a main space. So that was it regarding the theoretical framing and some of the practices for democratic groups to be mindful of. Also, part of this presentation is the exercise part. So one can co-design a participatory process. This is the first exercise. Forming in groups, reading and internalizing the scenario for the design, and understand the outcome. And then going into the design practice, there the process steps can be co-designed, and also defining the different democratic tools, practices that can be used for any step, and then consent to it as a group. So this is also a practice where one can utilize the lessons learned in this democratic practices presentation. And yeah, essentially one has to define the scenario. One can use a process template. This is one of the practices I recommend for this particular topic. And then the other practice, like the second exercise, is a physical exercise, free dance, which will really help to understand the negative freedom and positive freedom. Essentially, negative freedom would be respecting the needs and boundaries of each and every person in the space, being aware, being mindful, do not intrude. The positive freedom is being in connection with one's own body and feelings, how one would like to dance, what kind of movement one's body needs, and make oneself move. So this is really about the freedom and conscious of space, but also managing the polarities, all of these things in a very practical physical sense. And this is an opportunity to create the dance moves with others in the common space. So already start to create connections and interactions in a space. So one theoretical exercise, one really, really practical exercise to go together with the context theory and practices portion of democratic practices in big groups. That is my presentation. Thank you so much for your time and very kind attention. Thank you.